What specifically should banks be paying attention to, whether in the database space or any technology space, is really clarity on definitions, what they're getting. And that gets down into the legal. People are reading contracts and whatnot, but just having those conversations, and words matter, and being careful with how things are being thrown around. There's a lot of things that are speed to market right now, and trying to figure out what those unintended consequences are. I do think that, as I've already mentioned, that databases tend to be more conservative, finance tends to be more conservative, but there's lots going on. And so maintaining those standards and maybe even hardening them at times, which is counterintuitive to speed to market.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Grizz Griswold of FINOS. Hope you're doing well. Today, I have the CEO of Percona with me, Anne Schlemmer. Anne, how are you doing today?
Terrific, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. I didn't get a chance to meet you in London, but I'm happy that we have this time today, and I'd love to hear about you. I'd love to hear about Percona. I'd love to hear about even a talk that we're going to do at OSFF, Unlocking Competitive Advantage of Financial Institutions Guide to Open Source. Everything fits, but we'll get there. Let's talk about Anne. You're the CEO of an open source first company, and I'd just like to know, how do we get that job? Not your particular job. I'm just saying.
Coming at me, Aaron. I love it. There you go.
Okay.
How do you get that job? That's an interesting one. I had the good fortune to take over for a founder. So one way to get the job is you can found a company. You could be the entrepreneur and start the company. That's not
true.
the route. That's not the route that I took, right?
Very-
As I tell people, how I got to Percona was the journey of falling into open source. So in a former life, I was a banker. Thanks, apropos for being here at FINOS.
Exactly.
Yeah. But then I actually took a break from my career for 8 years. And when I came back into the workforce, I had the good fortune of a neighbor and friend was working for MySQL AB. And I joked that I'm like, the gig is up. I gotta go back to work. You gotta get some health care, because my husband was going into self-employment. I was like, oh, and I started working with the MySQL team right when they got purchased by Sun, and then they got purchased by Oracle. And so I was with them that full time. The opportunity to come to Percona was over 11 years ago. And it was that same neighbor and friend had moved to Percona. And some of the folks that I had worked with at Oracle and Sun were in Percona. And at the time, the decision to go from a large company to a smaller company, they're still in the startup phase. Percona is 18 years old now. So I joined them when they were at 7. Was really, for me, it was a mindset of, okay, this isn't a job. This is back really career-wise. And I have just had subsequent opportunities while I've been here to run different departments, learn different things. And Peter Zaitsev, who's our founder and former CEO, back in 2018, he had asked me to work with him more closely on running the business. And that was a recognition of him at that time, what were his strengths and desires. And as I tell people, any assessment we took, whether it was predictive index or DISC or COBA, if Peter was high, I was low. If I was high, Peter was low. So to answer your question, how does one get this job? Again, if you're not starting the company, you partner maybe with that founder or entrepreneur as it grows, and offsetting complementary skills, I would say, is how I got here. Yeah.
Can we go back a little bit in time? So what led you, maybe what area of banking, and what kind of led you to, what was your degree in? I really want to know the background, because it's, now that you told me that you were in banking and then you've gone into the open source side, is very interesting.
Yes. My undergrad, so it's all starts places, right? My undergrad was in finance. And out of college, I had the good fortune of getting in a training program that was retail banking, commercial lending. I also, during that time, was able to get an MBA, and my MBA was in entrepreneurial studies. I actually did not do banking finance. I'm like, "Oh, I got that in undergrad. We're going to do something different for graduate." So that fast forwards to Percona, why it was interesting because of that study. But also
Mhm.
then when I was in banking, I waited through that program. I had a branch that I was managing commercial lending, but then I had an opportunity to trade currency. I moved into our corporate foreign exchange team. So I did that for about 6 years as well
Hmm.
before I left the workforce. So a pretty big gamut when you think
Yeah.
about right? Banking in general, the roles that I did, I would really call it financial sales. So whether it was in the branch and the lenders, but then the commercial or the corporate foreign exchange that I was doing was risk management and trading currency with our corporate clients. Yeah.
And then back to Sun and Oracle. Again, you're falling into open source, but and I know that I'm assuming that was the time where Oracle was less known for open source at the time. I remember running open source conferences back in 2011, 2010, and Oracle and Microsoft, not to say anything bad, but at the time they weren't really considered on the open source side. So talk a little bit about that and what were you doing there in order that eventually brought you to Percona?
So when I joined MySQL, I was in their professional services team and I was coordinator that I was coordinating the consultants. So much more of an administrative role, not technical, but I got to sit with all the tech. So
Mhm.
I absorbed from the conversations that the consultants were having because they were world class, best of the best. So during that evolution of being with that team, when they went from Sun over to Oracle, just as how Oracle ran the business unit, I just had opportunity to be exposed again to more of the administrative side of running a professional services team is
Right.
what that exposure was. To your point about, okay, what was it like? Oracle wasn't known for open source. It was an interesting journey because we don't want to offend anybody. I didn't have religion around open source at
Yeah,
that point in time. So
right.
when the announcement came of Oracle buying Sun, oh, people fled. They're like,
Yeah,
"Oh no,
I remember.
no way can we do this." And being inside of Oracle, I was like, okay, really at the time, Oracle was being a good steward of MySQL. There's quite a
Mhm.
bit that they did, even though the whole Sun Oracle merger was held up because of antitrust in Europe of Oracle's going to kill MySQL.
Right.
See, right? That happened. But it was interesting being mindful. And again, I have a business degree. I was in banking, all that. I was watching like, hey, if Oracle goes into a space, at least back then, it was they want to be number one in whatever
Mhm.
space they went into. So it's not, they weren't going to be they had that mindset, right? So
That's
here's
fair.
MySQL. We want it to continue to be growing. And there is that open core way of going about it. They had the community version, but they also had that commercial version that they were doing and they were wanting to grow and provide value. So it's super interesting learning experience and still just growing up for me, really still in open source and trying to understand and see all the different perspectives. By the time I moved to Percona, I think I definitely I've had a different education about the open source community than what I had when I was at Sun and Oracle, for sure.
That's interesting. And then I've seen, Dave Stokes now works for you and he was part of that team. I don't know if you worked with him there or not, but I saw that recently. I was like, oh, because
Yeah.
Dave has spoken at a lot of my conferences before.
Sure.
So I'm just name dropping at this point. We're not actually talking, man. So
Wow.
I know Peter, I know Dave.
Community guy, that shows that you're a community person. That's
Yeah,
all.
and that's again, I've known Peter for a long time, and I've known about Percona for a long time, and that was pre being part of the Linux Foundation or FINOS and everything. So I actually have these happy moments when we get a new member, and it's somebody that I've known was in the open source community when there was no real open source community. So when Percona came in last year, I'm like, oh, awesome, that is really cool. Enough about me. Let's talk a little bit about the talk your talk, Unlocking Competitive Advantage of Financial Institutions Guide to Open Source. Let's talk about why you feel banks and financial services in general, why they're coming to open source, and then obviously, and then coming to Percona. And we need to probably explain what Percona does at some point as well, somewhere in there. I say this, I've been saying this for many years. When I first started getting involved with open source, 20, 2012, 20, some 2011, there was a lot of raw open source. Not what do we do with it? It's just, hey, we got to do this. When I came into this industry back in 2017, I was like, oh my God, we're doing this again. Like, I thought we were over that. And now we're having to say raw open source for the banking sector. I don't get
Mhm.
it. Then I started to understand regulation and things like that and understand that. But we are coming to, I think, less about open source and more about the practical applications of it and how
Sure.
it's not only about the consumption, but into the contribution as well. But can you talk about why you're seeing, from Percona's perspective, from your perspective, as somebody who was also in the banking world as well, is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Why are we moving there? A lot
Right.
of
So
questions. Answer all of them, please.
sure. Here we are. So for those that don't know, Percona, we are open source databases, specifically MySQL, MongoDB, Postgres. We've also entered with Valkey, another Linux foundation, which is Redis. Why, Rob? Why, why in baking now? Or why are we thinking about it in this financial services space? It's an industry like many that it keeps going through disruptions and evolutions, right? We go back to the financial crisis in 2008 and
And
what did that bring upon the industry, right? Then you couple it on top of the cloud. What has the cloud done for everything in digital transformation? And then just financial services in general and mobile apps and all of that. Really thinking about, okay, banking is highly regulated, you tend to think conservative, right? You want to think conservative, yet have to continue to evolve. So why would the raw open source? I think it's more about keeping up to be competitive in any industry, right? So we continue to have emerging technologies. The vast majority at this point, and there's a lot of studies that show this, are being built on top of open source, right? So your for developers, they want to play with something. Great to be able to just go find a project, an open source project, and have at it and build at it without that cost, right?
right.
We also see, not specific necessarily to financial services, but makes sense, is trying to standardize inside an organization. It's not uncommon that some of the larger banks like have grown through acquisitions as they buy some of the middle tier banks or community banks, and they want to be able to standardize. You can do that again with some of the open source, maybe with potentially with more ease. If you look at it, we would be remiss to not talk about cost, right? What are those efficiencies? What's that total cost of ownership to be able to handle it as well? So those areas we can speak to that specifically for banks, but as you continue, we know that security is important, right? Obviously, that scalability and the cost are all things to look at that banks are looking at. And I think it's finding a different way of going about business. It's not just the proprietary software any longer. That's maybe the mindset of others or banks over time, right? Like I said, tend to be conservative, tend to have legacy symptoms. But as right, it says new technology. If you, I don't know, I was laughing the other day, having a conversation with somebody, but who would have thought in my generation that I would ever be banking on a phone,
Mhm.
right? Going into the branches and, oh no, wait, I actually can get a check from somebody, though a lot of people don't do checks anymore. But if you get a check, you don't have to go to the ATM. I can take a picture on my phone and deposit it. So that is another reason why are we here again on raw open source is, hey, no, there's a better way of going about this and growing and learning and technology. And open source is a great way to do all those things, to be innovative. You can be collaborative. It's still secure. It's cost effective. And oh, by the way, you might have a better chance of finding talent because it's out there for everybody to see and be using, as opposed to proprietary technology that you might not have as many experts out there to be a talent pool to be getting from.
Let me go on the other side of that. And is there ever a case you think in databases or anywhere, is there
Mhm.
ever a case to where proprietary software at this point makes sense? Maybe not even for the banking industry, maybe specifically for the banking industry because of the regulated nature of it. Is there a business case that somebody could say, not even open core and you're building on top of, well, everybody's building on top of open source, right?
Everybody's built that comes up the services, right?
Sorry, we
Yeah.
ruined the argument there. But is there ever a case for having proprietary, me too,
Proprietary.
proprietary software that is either developed inside the bank or that is coming from an outside vendor?
I would say developing inside the bank and keeping it all closed, probably. So, my take on all of this is, so this is a thing, right? We're in open source, but oh, by the way, I would like to announce that I am a for-profit business,
Oh, yes.
right? And a capitalist, right? So, and I'm an American. I'm in the United States, and that matters, right? Because whenever that word free comes along, for me, it's freedom of choice and and giving you that flexibility. So if it's proprietary, for me, it always goes back to what's the value. So me as a vendor, Percona has to be providing value in everything that we do. We have to be wowing our customers. And we believe in doing that with open source. But open source in and of itself isn't going to provide value, right?
Right.
It has to be the right tool for the job. So if a bank is saying, hey, this we see is really core and really important, and they don't want maybe the extra that comes with building a community or being part of a
Yeah.
project, because there's extra to that, right? So
Oh,
I think,
yes.
right? So we talk about it's a lower cost of ownership, but in fact, when you think about it, there is other costs. There's other considerations. So sure, there's probably a time and a place and where proprietary would work, but I would think long and hard in terms of the criticality and the overall business and the reliance of that, and how do you mitigate that? So if it's internal proprietary software, really making sure that you don't have single points of failure, right? Documentation, all of that. If you are doing that as an external vendor, how confident and any of your vendors, right? How confident and comfortable are you that it's going to be a going concern, that you have enough visibility into what they're doing? And again, what's the criticality for your overall business?
I've never asked that question before. I just,
Thanks a lot.
yeah, well, you're welcome. But it did occur to me while you were talking, we have seen in total cost of ownership, we have seen, obviously, we're a foundation that helps foster open source communities around open source projects. And, but we definitely have seen when some projects come out of the banks that it's just like I would say that there was probably a certain point where open source, and I've had people tell me this before, that open source was a dumping ground for banks to where they're like, hey, we'll open source this, put it out there. And then they're just like,
We're
whatever. Yeah,
done.
exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, we're done with that. Again, we're getting past the raw because we are seeing critical, they're not critical to the entire infrastructure of banking yet, but we're seeing critical projects come out that multiple banks are working with each other within those projects legally, antitrust, all the above, in order to further those projects and make something better that they can all build on top of. But there is that cost of ownership of like, how do you continue to build a community so that you have more people involved, more eyeballs, but more, do you have any thoughts? Tell me how we do that better after what you've seen being in the open
Right.
source world for a while.
But it's interesting. So we look at communities, like, for example, with us, Percona joining the Valkey community, with Redis changing their license, which is a whole
Right.
other, great,
I
like
want to
that.
talk about that. Yes.
Yeah, the buzz. But what is one of the driving forces behind it is that it's such a widely adopted project that is critical to so many people. And corporations want to be able to have a strong community project that they can build upon and put their own value add, whether it's for ultimately for some form of monetization, however they do that, right? So be clear on that. So how do you get better at the question of that community? When I think about specifically for banks, and one of the initiatives that is with FINOS is the cloud controls, right? And what does that look like? And now that also like the AI and what are that work being done there? Why is that important in a regulated industry? Isn't it great to be able to say, hey, we're building off of this standard, and our I was about to say colleagues, that's not the right word, but the other folks in the industry are building on it as well. So it's
Peers.
not like
Yeah.
you bring in a regulator and you have to tell them your weird and wonderful way of doing stuff, and then they're in your business much longer than you may want them to be. And no, we've all agreed on this. It's not collusion. It's not any of those things. These are
Right.
the standards. We've done rigor, diligence, and all of that. And then that's just better ultimately at the end of the day for the consumer, for the customer, because it's something that can be trusted, right? Ultimately, all of this comes down to, like I mentioned, value for the end user. And that is a lot of times based on trust, right? Do you trust that? And having something more widely adopted, it helps with that. But how do you, as a business, or so you as a foundation, how do you convince banks to say, no, it's really in your interest to contribute time, talent, right? The time and the talent into this, because here's what you're going to get out of it.
Right.
Right. I think that the challenge is also then just the staying power of all of that. Right. So, how do we create these standards when I get off the phone with you and I've got demands of a customer or of a board or my staff? Right. Like we have competing priorities, but it's a matter of really paying attention to how it all wraps up together.
It's interesting that you brought common cloud controls because I had one direction I was going to go on it, and I was going to say that when you were talking about it and you're talking about the regulators, the reason common cloud controls actually was brought up last year by Citi was they've been doing studies and talking to regulators and had other banks as well. And basically, regulators can't go on the record and say, hey, you should do this until there's an actual regulation that comes out. But basically, the banks started to look at things and said, we're on the hook, not the vendors. We're on the hook for when
Yeah.
something goes wrong as far as the regulators are concerned. And even if we have multi cloud and we don't have this vendor lock in, something has to be standard so that we understand what happens when data goes up and then it comes back down. What are the
Yeah.
attack vectors? And because otherwise the regulators are going to regulate on this, where I don't think I have very many regulators that listen to this show. And if you do, hey, contact me. But honestly, they're not at the tip of the spear
Yeah.
technology wise in order to say, this is what you should be doing.
That's
Right.
right.
And you were going to
Well,
say,
I was just thinking, like, they have their charter and their mandate. Why are they there to regulate? Again, it's to protect the consumer, protect the public, or however, right? But however you want to phrase that. So I think the common cloud controls coming together, there's going to be a cost. There's going to be a cost somewhere. Wouldn't you like to be a little bit more in control of that, right? The phrase that jumped in my head was like self-policing. Hey, look,
yes.
we're doing this, and we're doing this as a group. We're doing this out in the open, and we have a third party through FINOS, right? Like a foundation, all those things.
Steward. Yeah.
Yeah. So it just makes a lot of sense. It just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
You know what I
man.
mean?
And I think actually the term so internal when we were talking was more around self-regulation. So
Yeah.
yeah, self-policing is exactly it's how do we make sure that we do the right thing
Yeah.
so that it's we're doing I always go back to it's not altruistic but it's good. And if you can do the right thing, if you can do the good thing, then, it's not altruistic because we are trying to make money. Yes. But at the
Sure.
same time, we're doing good. Ultimately, we're protecting you and me, who
Right.
does look at your phone and types things on there and sends money to somebody, and because that's what has to be done. And so there are times, again, when I joined this company, when I joined this industry, I was like, wow, are we sure that this is the right thing? But I have seen a lot of good come out of the things you know, that just people do. So I now the other thing on common cloud controls, it's a standard. It's a standard for using
Mhm.
single or multi-cloud in order to make sure that, like I said, that there's obviously commonality in the taxonomy and ontology that is used by the vendors, by the banks, and the regulators so that everybody is on the same page. Then it's easier to deal with security. I wonder for you looking at databases, and so there are many flavors of databases, and you
Mhm.
obviously said that you deal with multiple. Do you ever see a point to where in a regulated industry like this or healthcare, and maybe I just don't know, but are there standards that on the regulation side that either we should be paying attention to that are already there, or that other banks should say, hey, in order to self-regulate, is that even a thing that the bank should be paying attention to?
I think they pay attention to it in manners of, we talked about all your software you want to be secure, right?
Mhm.
Secure by design. Here at Percona, which I'm sure isn't unique to us, one of our software principles is do no harm, right?
Yes.
So it's why that we right, make sure that we're looking at that. We've got people's data, and that's already highly regulated, right? Upon us, upon the industries, like you said, on the industries, the PII, all of that. You're just there's a lot of controls that are already in place and that we've continued to follow. I think that something to be mindful of is in this evolving technology landscape, and right, it's the podcast in 2024, so we have to say AI once, Aaron.
Took us
But
a
I think
long time to get there
yeah, we
again.
did. How about that? You bet. Maybe we should just change our names. It's both our first initial. Right? Somehow definitions are mattering, right? And even just the true open source and how people are using open source. And again, that license conversation.
Well, interesting because so I'm reading back through your abstract, and I know it was a long time ago. But something that caught me in it earlier was this talk is tailored explicitly to why adopting open source technologies, particularly databases, benefits financial institutions by giving them a competitive advantage. And again, I guess my thought is that's not something that I would think of. Why would and why would open source databases, how would that give me as a bank competitive advantage? What
Sure, say, well,
tell me and give me your job.
there's a clear,
I said no.
there's a clear theme going here, man. I hear you. So, uh, a couple things. So, we'll start with maybe some of the obvious, but or not some of the things that I've talked about. Looking at first off the strategic vision that banks are in, right? So,
Mhm.
traditional banks, as I mentioned, starting back in 2008, the worlds were rocked. Regulators came in big. You have to start thinking differently. You've got the cloud, you've got mobile, all of these things have evolved. So building on these new technologies, using open source really allows for agility and flexibility, right? So it's not, there's ways to, it helps you not have limits on how you scale within your infrastructure, right? So that's key as I think about, I don't want to get into technical too much, but
It's okay.
with cloud native, right? And cloud native and Kubernetes and all of that, right? That's really important in in many open source projects. And we see this in databases too, like having extensibility, finding tools that go on top to be able to observe your databases. That concept, right? Of again, here's your open source. You can build upon it, get your tools. So that's always great in a business to have that level of agility and flexibility. I mentioned earlier, what's another advantage? resource attraction. Frankly, you're going to find a larger pool of engineers, typically on an open source project and in the database space. I can't imagine that there's any large financial institution that doesn't have multiple databases out there. So you want to make sure that you can find that talent pool, and there's an ability for them to grow because you have that community, right? So that if you're working on an open source, it's not just your colleagues within the company, depending on what your rules are, right? You can still get with the community for other ideas and innovation and whatnot. We already talked about cost effectiveness, right? What company, particularly what bank is looking on that? You could either have a reduction in licensing or no license costs, depending, right? Percona, we don't charge you a license for using our open source, using our database distributions. And also, there's you still would be supported. You have that expertise you see in open source and in the open source ecosystems, and a lot of service oriented structures, and also options, right? If you just think about the Postgres space, I don't know how familiar you are with them. There's so many vendors out there. And depending on your use case, you have multiple options. Then if you're going proprietary, you tend to have one option, right? And then also in this evolving market, why would this be an advantage on open source? Again, that concept of maybe being future proof of new technologies are being released with an open source focus. So if you want to be taking advantage of leading technology, evolving technology, really understanding that open source space and embracing that, I contend would give you a competitive advantage because you're up on what's going and seeing what those projects are and growing from it. So I think those all wrap into ways to have it be competitive, to help you have a competitive advantage.
Thank you.
You're
I
welcome.
sometimes ask questions because I just don't know the answer. I really want somebody to explain it. And I figured I should ask a good source. um, so we only said AI once, and we only said Kubernetes once, which was pretty good considering we are talking the space we're in. Kim, let's maybe to end out, let's talk about future proofing. Let's talk about future, like, what's the future of open source databases? We've seen obviously in the past 2 years to the public eye, this huge interest in AI and how fast
Mhm.
everything moves. And databases, like I'm assuming you've said that almost by nature that they are, what was the word you said? They they're static, not
They're conservative. I mean,
yes, thank you.
yeah,
You've
yeah,
said
yeah.
they're conservative. Thank you. At a certain point, kind of what is the future? What are you know, is it just about maintenance of these things and making them 1% better, or is there more to it that we should be looking out?
Oh, yeah. Daily, we see customers pushing the limit, right? In changing, put new workloads on it, seeing how far it can go. So you're watching the databases evolve. Some are trying to do it, right? We're trying to do it within Postgres or MySQL. You're hearing a lot about vector support, MongoDB, like seeing these new use cases that are coming because of machine learning and because of AI and because of all of what's happening with data
Mhm.
and the explosion, I dare say, of all the data, what's happening. So but people don't want to rip and replace a new database, right? That's what I mean. On conservative, like
Right.
your data says you don't mess around with your data, right? And if it's working and it's stable, but you have new workloads, you have new ideas to come from it. We've seen new databases spin up, but a lot of them are built off these core databases that have been around because of these new workloads and technologies. So I see that continuing. I think that there's going to continue to be innovation on how do people make sure that they can access their databases in such a way that it talks to these new applications that's secure but
Mm.
performant, right? Super fast. You're seeing lots of like instantaneous. You want to have access to that. So that's gonna continue on, and in a space like open source in a space like Postgres, people saying, here's the core database, and I want this extension to do this. We're seeing that now. And I think that's just going to continue. And because of the ubiquitousness of, if that's a word, of certain databases, people are just going to tear them out. It's how do you make them work in this environment better, and what are those add-ons? So that's where we're seeing a lot of innovation and making sure that's happening, and again, looking at vectors and moving on. And I think that the market is wanting to see more of that still in an open source project, as opposed to just in the proprietary behind, where people are building on the base and then they're putting that all behind the paywall, which is their right, but that's business. But I think people are going to keep pushing to see what can happen in the open source space.
So it's conservative plus.
Conservative doesn't mean you don't evolve, because if you don't evolve, you die,
True.
right?
True.
Right? You just might not be on that leading edge or the bleeding edge, but you have to keep going, or you have to evolve. You have to evolve.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I learned a lot, because this is an area that, again, that I don't think is an underlying piece of the FINOS community that we don't talk enough about. So thank you. I would love for you to speak at one of the next OSFFs. And if you ever have time, again, I'd love to do this again. Just, again, I enjoy talking to people who get it, and I enjoy talking to people that can teach me. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And I think we'll end it there, if that's okay with you.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, cool. And so to the audience, then I'm going to say good day, good night, wherever you are. And thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Aaron.